So welcome everyone who has joined to this webinar on compassionate learning design. My name is Daniela Gashago. I have joined UCT about a year ago, or a bit more than a year now. It still feels quite new. I'm in CILT, in the Center of Innovation for Learning and Teaching and Academic Staff Development Unit. And yeah, today I'm going to talk about a topic that's very close to my heart, that we have been working on for a while with colleagues, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about who they are. But before we go there, I just want to know from you how you're feeling today. If you could just post in the chat how you're feeling right now. Tired, oh no, I'm so sorry. Is it your kids who keep you awake? Megan cold, yeah, me too. I keep drinking hot coffee, but it doesn't seem to work. Oh my gosh, 11 months old teething baby. Yeah, no, that's hard. Anybody else wants to tell us how they are? Neuro says exhausted. Oh no, I'm so sorry. Have you moved from UWC to UCT? Nikki needing the weekend, yeah, all of us. Well, thank you. So today we'll talk a little bit about, the current discomfort or unhappiness with instructional design and learning design model, and why we think or we suggest that we could move away from the idea of empathy. That's really like at the center of the current instructional design approaches, and to replace that with compassion. And that's really like a thought experiment. But what would happen if, rather than empathy, we thought we would look at learning design with compassion? And I mean, this is really a conversation. We are so few of us. I will ask you to share stories of compassion, and any questions that you have, comments, please just go ahead and raise your hand and, switch on your mic. Apologies, I've got such a cough. And then I'll introduce a model that two of my colleagues and I have been working on for about a year now, called Compassionate Learning Design. Maha Bali, Nicola Pallet, and myself, we've been working on an article and a book chapter on compassionate learning design, and the article was just published yesterday, very excitingly, and I will share the link to the article. And then we'll discuss the elements of this compassionate learning design model, but really with practical examples. And I'm hoping from your side, you'll jump in and share some examples from your side as well, because, this is really a space for sharing. We're such a small group, and conversation more than me talking. So my cough, I don't have to talk too much today. So that's the program for the next hour or so. But just to start us off with, how much do you know about instructional design or learning design? I know Simone knows a lot about that, but are you familiar with instructional design models? Have you used instructional design models in your own teaching? Does anybody want to share? By the way, welcome Nadine. Well, there's an instructional designer.
Thank you.
Welcome Kehinde, who also has joined us. I think that's it. So does anybody have, apart from the learning designers among us, but has anybody had some experiences with instructional design models? You can just raise your hand or put it in the chat. Have you used instructional design models or learning design models in your teaching? Okay, Simone says the ADI model. I think that's one of the most famous models. Analysis, design, development, implementation, evaluation. So the cycle of learning design. Anybody else? Is that completely new to you? Have you heard about instructional design? You can just unmute yourself, take the mic. Totally new. Okay, no, that's good. Anybody else? New for me. Okay, for Megan as well. So instructional design is really the idea of systematically defining a design process. And I mean, Nadine, we have learning designers here in our group, so please jump in if you want to say something. But it's the idea that we can, we can provide a structure for lecturers, for designers, for people like us in SILT to follow certain steps to come up with a systemic approach to designing learning. And it has a long history, and the design models have changed quite a lot. But often the design processes are quite linear. Yeah, so you start with your, you're defining your target group or defining your learning objectives, and from there maybe looking at contents that you want to teach and pedagogies that would support how the content is being taught, and you'll think about assessment, and you implement, and you get feedback from your students, and maybe you redesign a little bit. But the idea of learning design is always this very linear process. And it's also often quite siloed in a way that it's one learning designer or a lecturer designing the course. Maybe there's a team of colleagues designing, but it's still very much in control of the lecturer or the teacher or the designer in terms of how and who designs a course. It's quite siloed in a way that it's very focused on my immediate course and my immediate context, and does not maybe necessarily take into consideration the bigger institutional context that we are based in. And there's a lot of control, as I said, in the hand of designers. It's also often quite checklist bound. I mean, people who work in learning design, it's like often you follow rubrics and checklists and you tick off, have you thought about everything? So it's not very nuanced or complex. And most importantly, maybe it doesn't really consider often institutional power structures and how, who we are impacts on what we design. I mean, the learning designer, for example, and how who we are impacts on our learning design decisions has never been considered at all in learning or instructional design processes. So more recently, there has been quite a lot of critique around our, traditional instructional design or learning design models. And people have become more aware or have asked about the importance of critical instructional design or critical learning design, which is much more situated, contextual, nuanced, encouraging faculty or academics to think about their specific students, their specific needs, their specific institution, departments, missions, and also their specific political and social context that surrounds their courses each time they teach them. And people who work in our space, this is Robin DeRosa, who is a fantastic writer. If you're ever interested in, she has set up a collab at an institution in the US, where she has rethought faculty development, academic staff development radically and made it much more collaborative and shared and participatory. So really interesting ideas. She's challenging the whole idea that we can design, most of the design is backward design. So you start with learning objectives and then go backwards and say, okay, what do I have to teach if I want to reach these objectives? And Robin DeRosa says about how in our context, how in our current context and time, do we even know what kind of learning objectives our students want to achieve? So how can we even start at the end when we don't know what the end is? So she is really kind of challenging us to rethink the process of learning design. And one of the big changes to, I think, our work, especially SILT as well, is the introduction of design thinking processes into learning design. So the D School, don't know who is familiar with the idea of the design thinking process or approach, but they have really revolutionized learning design by saying, rather than learning objectives or outcomes or exit level outcomes or contents, we need to start with the people that we are designing for. We have to start with our students. We have to understand who our students are, what they want, what they need, and start from there when we start designing our courses. So involve our students, and in an ideal world, co-design with our students. So they start, if anybody of you has ever, taken part in a design thinking process or workshop, I mean, we have got the DISCO here at UCT, you'll always start with a persona activity. So the persona activity is this idea of an ideal world. We are co-designing with our students, typical student personas. And that's how we start a course design process. We don't even know the learning objectives yet. We have to first think about who are the students in our class, who are the typical students that we encounter when we teach, and what are their needs, what are their kind of desires, what motivates them to study, what are their strengths, but also what are their weaknesses, how can we support them, where do they need help? And this, this then gives us a different way of thinking about our students in a much more nuanced and diverse way. So we don't have a homogeneous student body. I think you all know that by now. Our students are so diverse. They have such different needs. And when we design for students, we need to think about all these different students that are in our course. So the D-Score has allowed us really, and they have brought this idea of empathy. Yeah, this important idea of empathy into the conversation in learning design. It was the first time that somebody said, forget learning objectives, start with empathy. Start with empathy for the user that you're designing for, and then ideally designing with. So they are trying to get people, that the people that they're designing for, their users, in our case, our learners, into the design process. So they brought this empathy idea into the picture. And that was really interesting for a long time. I mean, at least in my practice, it has revolutionized how we design courses for a long time. But the empathy kind of assumes that you can put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Empathy assumes that we can understand somebody else's needs and design for somebody else's needs, isn't it? I mean, this common sense idea, empathy is putting myself in somebody else's shoes. But I think what kind of started to bother me in particular, because so in my PhD thesis, I looked at difference, and I looked at engagement and conversations across difference in using digital storytelling in classrooms. And I used a lot of Iris Marianne-Young's ideas that, you can't put yourself in somebody else's shoes. We will never know, what somebody else might feel or need, because we are always differently positioned. So there's no way, or there's never a point where I can actually understand what the other person needs. Does that make sense? Because we're always differently positioned based on who we are and how we are positioned in the world, but also based on our experiences and what we have what we have gone through. It's really difficult to understand the other person. And there's always this, she says, we have to accept that there's always this distance between me and the other, and I have to cherish that distance. And I mean, she talks about wonder and, the openness to understand that the other has, that I might not totally understand the other, but I can try. But she really, she challenges this idea of empathy. And she puts forward this idea of compassion. Yeah. So in my thesis, I did a lot of very theoretically engagement around what is the difference between empathy and compassion. So last year, at one point in a conversation with Nicola and Maha, we were like, so what would happen if we took the design thinking process and rather than empathy, we would put compassion at the center of the design thinking process? And I'd like to hear from you, what would happen if we, if we instead of thinking empathy, we thought compassion? What comes up to your mind when you think compassion rather than empathy? And you can just put it in the chat, or you can, switch on your mic. And what is it that comes to mind when you think compassion rather than empathy? And let's do a waterfall. So don't push it immediately. I'll give you some time to think, and then I'll count you down, and you can press enter in the chat. So I'll give you about 10 seconds or so, 20 seconds to think. Okay, let me count you down. 3, 2, 1, go. Let's see what comes up. What comes to mind? Okay. Nuro says, or Nadia says, compassion is more real and kinder. Interesting. Nadine says, being authentic, really care for one another. Nikki says, compassion gets us to think more practically how we can help. Exactly. What else? So real, kindness, authenticity, practically action. Lovely. So when you look at this, there's something else. Simone says, empathy is hard for me. You immerse yourself in that person's struggles and pain. Yeah, often you lose that boundary. Yeah, thank you, Simone. I mean, empathy is often, compassion has a bit of distance. Thank you, Simone. So compassion is, so these are just some definitions. There are so many. And I mean, yeah, but these two I just found useful for my own understanding of compassion. So Curtin, who is an ecofeminist, says, compassion is a cultivated feeling about emotions. So it's cultivated. There's something you do with it. It is a place where how we feel, but also how we think and how we act come together. In other words, compassion is a cultivated practice, not an isolated rational judgment about the world. So it's something that we do over time and that we can practice and we can get better at. And it's something that has to do with acting. I think you said, Nikki said that it has to do with being practical. There's also a sense of urgency sometimes when it comes to compassion. It's something that really makes us act. The next definition, I think, speaks about that. It says, compassion goes beyond the feeling for to a feeling with an individual and moves towards understanding the social and political structures of our society. So it is also much more encompassing. It's not just me and the individual person that I feel empathy for, but I see that person and me and our relationship within a bigger picture of social and political structures. It is then much more than putting oneself in somebody else's shoe, but assumes responsibility for one's own role in somebody else's story. So I think you also said that it's, you know, it's about understanding what can I do and how am I responsible for the other person. It creates urgency for practice, for action. I think that really became very important for me. It's this idea that compassion is first of all a sustained practice. It's something that we can get better at. It is long-term. It gives us that little bit of space to step back and to reflect. So the think and the feel and the act together. And also the understanding of how the micro and the macro, the personal and the political are embedded or entangled. And always I put myself into the equation. So I'm not just feeling sorry for somebody, but I'm also thinking about how am I implicated in the other person's life and what can I do? What is my responsibility? Shelley, no problem. I hope, yeah, the recording will be fine for you as well. Does that make sense? Does the difference between empathy and compassion? You can just give me a thumbs up. If you have any questions, just stop me. One thumbs up from Simone. Okay, fantastic. And Megan, perfect. Nadine and Nikki, okay, fantastic. Please just stop and, you know, ask me any question, raise your hand, unmute if you have anything, any comments. So if we think about compassion, yeah, in the way we have defined it now, are there any ways that you've seen compassion in your practice? Either you have observed it, you have experienced compassion, or you have acted with compassion. And I think we are enough to do breakout rooms. Max, can I do that? Can I create breakout rooms? Is Max still there? Yes, I can. So we are, I think about, yeah, I think we should be able to have 3 breakout rooms with 2 people per room. And I'll give you, maybe 10 minutes is too long, but I'll give you maybe 7 minutes, yeah, because it's just 2 per room. And I will put you in these breakout rooms and you can just share stories of compassion with the person that you find in the room. If there's nobody in the room or if people have problems, you know, talking, just let me know. Is that okay? 7 minutes and I'm opening the rooms now. So welcome back, everyone. How was that? Did you find stories of compassion? Would you like, is there anybody who would like to share a story of compassion? Anybody? Nadine, yeah, go ahead.
Daniela, I don't necessarily have a story to share, but Kinder and I was in a breakout group, and we talked towards the end about the intentionality that is needed, I think, in order to succeed with compassionate learning design, because we both shared that, you know, we feel that we try to embody empathy with people, but as we said, that's not necessarily enough. So you need to act upon this and thinking through strategies. So the word that Tintu came up, and she beautifully said it, that we need to be intentional. It doesn't just happen by accident. So
no, Maha speaks a lot about intentional hospitality and how she sees her design or her facilitation as intentional hospitality. You're so right. I mean, it is something that we have to be intentional, but I think what I find so helpful is that it's something that we can get better at, you know, this idea that compassion as a practice, you know, it's something that we can get better at. Yeah, thank you for that. Is there anybody else who'd like to share what came up in their conversations? Nadia, yeah.
Hi, I'm going to, sorry, Simone, I hope it's okay, but I'm going to share what you're doing as maybe as an act of compassion to showcase Simone. She's a mentor at UCT for students that are struggling, but with the food insecurity. So it's slightly different to, I think, you'd sort of, you know, the teaching aspects, but still within the, you know, obviously within education and mentoring. But a group of the staff have got together and sort of left food for students. So there's sort of no questions asked, and people can just come and take, you know, get food, peanut butter, bread, basket of fruit. And I think, you know, the thing for me is that it's you're aware, you're preempting problems that might be coming up. I think, you know, the world's going through a bit of a living crisis at the moment and so on, but it's sort of almost preempting what could happen and putting forward that act of compassion by providing. So yeah.
Lovely. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else? Is there the third group? There was one more group, I think. Nikki, maybe? Megan, yeah?
I'm sure, yeah. So Megan and I actually are both not involved in teaching. So we were just first discussing that. But the example that I think I came up with, I sort of oversee the extended degree program and the support that happens in that space. So I'm mostly working to support tutors. But I think an example that we spoke about was I often have a lot of students coming who have now fallen behind. So on their assessments and their submissions. So often it's working with the student to design a sort of submission plan where they can meet what's required. And it involves a lot of check-in. And I think, you know, it could be easy to say to the students, okay, well, or, you know, to say, okay, they could miss that assignment and not do that assignment. But it's also about getting them to have some sort of accountability for their assessment. And so working with a plan that works with what is attainable and getting them to talk through those moments, and also being quite flexible, I think, in that plan. So for example, if, you know, we said that next week the student should come with an outline of the essay, and they haven't come with that outline, it's also a moment for sort of a conversation around, well, perhaps they didn't understand the question, or perhaps they're struggling with understanding the reading. And so, yeah, that's, I think, a lot of where I've been exercising compassion or trying to do it more practically.
Interesting. Well, thank you. And I mean, you mentioned something really important, and this is idea of this designing with the students. And this takes us really to the next part of the presentation, where I'll talk about our compassionate learning design model. As I mentioned, we developed this with Maha Bali and Nicola Palit. Maha is at Cairo, at the American University in Cairo. Nicola used to be at UCT and is now in Rhodes, and we are all academic staff developers. So we're in very similar roles, but in different contexts. But we got I think we have all a shared concern around social justice and learning design, and pushing the boundaries when we think about learning design. And in our conversations, we've been talking for a while and writing for a while. And as I mentioned, about a year ago, we started this conversation or this kind of thought experiment about compassionate learning design. What would happen if we replaced empathy with compassion? And it kind of started like quite a theoretical or conceptual thought experiment, but it got us somewhere where we thought it's actually an interesting way of thinking about learning design. And in our conversations, we came up with 3 elements that are crucial for us in terms of compassionate learning design. And one is participation. So this idea that we have to, and that comes from co-design and the idea of student as partners, this idea that we can't design for somebody. We don't know what our students need, what our students want, who our students are. So unless we bring them in various ways, in however way we can, we are designing for somebody that's like a virtual somebody that doesn't exist. So we need to bring our students on board. And then I guess what drives us is the idea of working towards justice, and justice we see as an understanding of power and history and how that affects our ability to participate. So yes, we want everybody to participate, but we also have to understand that people can't participate the same way depending on who they are, their positionality, intersectionality, and how that influences our pedagogy. And that includes understanding our own positionality and who we are and how that impacts on our design decisions. And then I guess underlying all of this, underpinning or framed by, is a pedagogy of care. I guess we all try, and especially during COVID, we all got challenged to be so much more as lecturers than maybe we used to be, and the pastoral role became so much more important to effect. And I think that's why a lot of the burnout and the exhaustion came, because suddenly our roles were so much larger and we didn't really know how to really respond to our students in that role. And then I'll talk about this a little bit later. We argue that if these 3 dimensions are in place, or at least if we reflect and we try and incorporate as well as we can this dimension into our practice, then we could move towards, what Freire would call a praxis. So, the commitment to act, to take responsibility, to move towards a more socially just learning design. And so the first element, participation, is really, I think that's kind of bubbling up all over the place. I mean, whether it's from a Freirean dialogical, involving students idea, or the whole design thinking, co-creation, participatory design approach, or the student engagement literature, the student as partners is very much linked to student engagement. This idea that, we have to involve our students in all levels, in the design, in the facilitation, and the research on teaching and learning. Their voice, they are the experts there's a recognition that, they hold a lot of expertise. And I think within the whole decolonial or decolonization movement, I think this idea of student voice has become really core to what we need to do. So in our learning design model, we use Vehi Pehana's participation continuum, because we found that really useful, because participation is so broad. What do we mean by that? Often, it's quite a intangible term. What is it actually that we mean by participation? And Vehi Pehana, in the context of indigenous monitoring and evaluation, but still quite useful, says there's this continuum of participation. And the importance is that we are aware of where we are on this continuum. So on the lowest level of participation is we're designing to a student. So we might have service from previous students, or maybe the persona activity, we visualize, we make up students based on our experience and the typical students that we have, but it's the educator who drives that process. It's the educator's assumption, perceptions, experiences that kind of impact on the design. While if we move towards a 4, you know, that is a little bit better, because at least we are aware of who our students are. You know, we might have some information about our current students. You know, maybe we have sent them a survey, a pre-course survey with some, you know, what are their expectations, what are their skills, what are the knowledges. So we have some information about our current students, and we can shape our design for these students, for our actual students. But then the designing with, and I think, you know, Nikki, this is where I thought fantastic that you're bringing this idea. If we design with, we actually invite our current students into the design process. Huh? And that's not always easy, because, you know, sometimes you have to be, you know, you have to take decisions around design before you even start a course. But there are ways of involving your students as you're designing your course and as you're teaching your course. So for example, what we often do is we do have you know, a broad structure for assessment or plan of how we want to assess our students, but we co-design rubrics, for example, together with our students. So we create spaces where students can shape how they want to be assessed, for example. If a course is designed by students, the students actually take, you know, the lead and they design. And as lecturers, we stand back and we facilitate. We are currently in a co-creation process with student affairs, and we're designing a student leadership academy. And that is a process that needs to be driven by students. We can facilitate and support the process, but the students must have the main voice. And designing as the highest level would be when there's no educator in the picture. Maybe it's a, you know, it's a non-formal course, or, you know, an extracurricular activity where the students are actually leading the process on their own and designing learning for themselves. And the thing is, I mean, contexts are different, and disciplinary requirements and institutional and departmental requirements are different. So we can't all move, you know, to maybe with or by and as. But the importance for me, or why I find this model so useful, is that we can position ourselves and see where we are right now. And then, you know, think about where would we like to move to and how could we get there? How does that sound? How does that make sense? Have you, I mean, how are you designing? How do you have some form of participation by students? I mean, Nikki said she's designing with students their own assignments. So that's an example of designing with. Do you have other examples? On how you create participation with students? Yeah, go ahead, Simone.
Yeah, I just recently taught on a gender module, and you know, very often there's lots of controversial and I want to say contested topics that come up in you know, in the gender space around, you know, transgendered individuals, gay and lesbian individuals, and then, you know, gender, the sociological constructs. And at the end of the module, students have to write this position paper, and very often there are so many topics, so they then throughout the course get to co-construct the topics that we present each week. And then at the end of the module, they then get to decide which topic they want to produce as part of their position paper, because here they can then argue a point that maybe the literature doesn't always support. So yeah, it's just one other way that we've done it in gender studies to look at co-creating curricula with students.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Is there anybody else who would like to share? How they bring, yeah, go ahead, Megan.
So I don't have an example, and I'd love to hear more examples. But I'm just thinking, I mean, there is an element of expectation from students that there is already a curriculum. So, I mean, I think obviously it depends on the level of study. So sort of the earlier students probably expect a curriculum and expect to be guided by the lecturer compared to, say, a master's student or a final year student who is a little bit more familiar with the academic environment, has more of a voice, has more direction as to where they would like to go in terms of what they're learning. So I think it does depend on a lot of things, including level of study. But I mean, that's why I would love to hear more examples, because I just can't imagine, you know, going into a first year course and then co-designing it with the students. Yeah, so I would love to hear sort of examples.
So the student as partners literature would show how undergraduate students can be involved in curriculum design, often before a course starts. You would then work either with students from previous years, or maybe somehow get students involved before course start, and just bring in students to bring in examples, to ask them, you know, what would be meaningful for them, to tweak the curriculum to something that they would find meaningful. What does Simon says? I think it's good to have a framework for earlier levels. Yes, absolutely. I think we all are more involved in postgraduate teaching, where it's much easier to get students involved. But there are some really exciting ideas also to get first younger students involved in curriculum design. It can be a full curriculum before, you know, if you design a new program, you can involve students in a full curriculum, but you can also involve students in designing parts of the curriculum, maybe designing one assessment, or, you know, I mean, there can be tiny examples of where lecturers ask students to design questions for the next test. Yeah? So in the class before the test, they would collect questions from students that could go in a test, and then they would select the best ones. That's just a tiny examples or small examples of how students can be involved in design.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes total sense, actually, rather than designing a curriculum.
No, it's not necessarily the full curriculum. It can be. Yes. I mean, there are examples where people involve students in the full curriculum design, but it can also be elements. It's all about giving the students a sense that their voice counts.
Yes.
In however small or large way.
Yeah, I understand.
Yes, I actually wanted to alert, you know, just flag some of the work that was done by physiotherapist Michael Rowe, who I almost want to say removed the curriculum, took away all the learning materials, and allowed students then to, undergraduate students, I think they were second year, third year, and they had to write the, you know, build the literature that was used in that curriculum, and it allowed for the development initially of clinical reasoning. However, they also used the same content for the purposes of assessments, you know, so when they had to write an exam. So I think that was also one of the very innovative and very radical ideas in terms of how he'd done it. But I just wanted to just raise, you know, that, and all of it was done on Google, on the Google Suite. You know, they literally wrote the entire curriculum, students wrote it and owned it. And it was moderated, of course, by the lecturers, but they owned the content. They learned how to write content for their curriculum. And I actually thought it was a brilliant piece of curriculum development.
Thank you, Simone. That was a fantastic example. Yeah, I remember that. And I remember he gave students an opportunity to, I think, 20% of the assessment. They could choose how they wanted to be assessed. They could choose their own learning outcomes. Or maybe it was another, but I remember he had like 80% of learning outcomes were set, and then 20% of the mark of the grades, the students could choose their own learning outcomes. Lots of, thank you for that, Simone. Anyway, I know I'm looking, we've got 10 minutes left. So participation in our paper, for those who are interested, there are lots of examples across the different levels for, you know, how participation would look, you know, from to, for, with, by, as, and also what the conditions need to be for this kind of participation to happen. But then the second element that's really for us that is very closely connected to participation is justice. And this idea of who we are and how we are positioned impacts on how we how we can participate. And here, you know, Nancy Fraser is one author that we found really helpful in thinking about that, and her idea of participatory parity. So she defines social justice as being a society or an organization that would allow everyone to participate equally in society. So what would we have to do for students to be able to participate? If we want them to participate, if we want their participation, if we think that their voice is important, what kind of context, or how can we create spaces where everyone can actually participate, you know, irrespective of their level of studies, of their age, of their gender, of their race, of their language, of their culture. And she came up with the 3 elements of justice or injustice, and that's economic, so the resources that we need to participate, but also the social cultural, so who am I and how does that impact on my voice? And then the political, how much decision-making power do we have in that space? So that's another way of looking at participation and justice and the intersection of participation and justice. And again, in our paper, we have lots of examples of how, you know, how participation and justice would play out, or, you know, look like on this continuum from to as. Are there any questions here or any comments? So justice is really about thinking who we are and who our students are, and how can we create spaces? How do our design decisions, or how we design our spaces, impact on who has a voice, who doesn't have a voice, and how can we make a space that's more equitable for all voices? And then if there are no comments, the final element of our model is care. And then again, care intersecting with justice and participation. So here is really Joan Tronto, who is, you know, who talks about care again as being a practice, that's something that we can get better at, but also that who says, you know, there's a difference between good and bad care, and that care is not always necessarily good care, you know, unless it is a care that is democratic. So, and she would define democratic care as one that understands the power differentials, so understands how people are positioned, so the justice aspect, but also that allows, you know, that creates a care relationship where everybody has a voice. So the participation and care, that intersection. And again, our paper has a lot of examples of how that care and participate would look like along that participation continuum from to as. So these are our three elements of compassionate learning design. So the participation, the justice, and the care. So, and we argue that, you know, we define compassion in the context of learning design as a desire to create more participatory spaces, a recognition of power and positionality, how this affects our ability to participate, and finally, the centering of care and affect in the learning process. And we argue that when these 3 things come together, we might get into a space of praxis, you know, of that Freirean idea of praxis where theory, reflection, action come together. I know that was a lot for an hour. My apologies if that was quite dense. But as I mentioned, there is a paper, if you find this interesting, you can read up on. But maybe just the last 5 minutes, from what you have heard today, is there anything that sticks, anything that you think that was particularly useful, or that you think you could, an idea that you could engage with in your practice? Is there anybody who would like to take the mic and reflect on what you've heard? Yeah, Megan, please go ahead.
So so while I was talking to Nikki in our breakout room, I was saying that I think I will find it difficult to set a boundary for the compassion that I would give to a student.
Mhm.
So you know, how does one, so one wants to help a student in a particular way, but how does one stop oneself from going a bit too far in the help? You know, I think I would struggle with that a lot, setting boundaries, not getting too personally involved.
Yeah, I think that is a huge problem for a lot of us. And this is why I think the only way this can work is by having these kind of conversations with others and with students, and understanding, you know, what do I need to provide? Where can I step back? Where do I need to step back? The idea of self-care becomes really important here. And I think those are conversations we've never had, you know, especially during or after COVID, is how much can we give of ourselves and where is it enough, you know, and knowing that care is also so gendered, and, you know, there's such a strong gendered element to care, you know, as women, how do we respond to that?
Yeah.
So that's a really important a really important conversation to have. Any other comments, feedbacks? Kehinde or Nadia? Yeah, Nadia, Nikki, anything that stuck for you or that you found useful or difficult? Or
apologies. I think the real discussion around sort of empathy versus compassion, I think that really has stuck out for me, because it's something that I've I don't know, it's something that I think I'm aware of, but I haven't really thought about. And I think there's such a difference, and also just some of the examples that we were discussing as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Kehinde or Nikki? You can also just post in the chat. I wonder if we've lost them. But thank you so much for joining today. I know this is always quite a tough thing to get through in an hour, and especially, you know, having conversations and practical examples. I hope you found this useful, and yeah, if you want to, you know, continue the conversation, please just get in touch. We are going to, I mean, we are embarking on a number of learning design projects that are framed by this idea of compassionate learning design. So if you're interested in this, please just let us know. And otherwise, yeah, have a lovely end of the week, and hopefully the weekend comes soon for you, and you get some rest. And it was lovely meeting you.